The more awake you become, the more love stops fitting the way it used to. What once felt simple becomes strangely heavy, and what once pulled you in so easily now feels impossible to pretend through. This is the part of awakening most people avoid, the part where clarity begins to complicate the heart. Before we go deeper, answer this for yourself. Has your inner growth ever made you feel out of place in love? If the answer is yes, comment awake below. There comes a moment on the spiritual path when a person begins to wake up and something unexpected happens. They feel lighter. Their thoughts loosen. Their inner world becomes spacious in a way it never was before. They begin to sense a quiet connection with everything around them, as if the boundary between themselves and the world has become thinner, softer, almost transparent. And yet, right in the middle of this new clarity, another feeling rises. A strange ache, a kind of loneliness they cannot explain. They sit down and say they finally understand that they are part of something infinite. They feel the vastness of existence moving through them. They sense that life is not separate, that every wave belongs to the same ocean. And then, with a confused sigh, they wonder why they still cannot find love, why they feel disconnected from the very people they care about, why relationships that once felt exciting now feel strangely distant. It is here that the paradox reveals itself. They have just discovered their true nature, expansive and boundless. Yet they worry about not having someone to hold on Saturday night. The mind awakens to unity, while the heart clings to its old stories about companionship. It is almost comical, not because their pain is small, but because they do not yet see the deeper design behind this contradiction. This is where the real exploration begins. The meeting point between awakening and longing, the threshold where the old way of loving begins to unravel, and a new way has not yet emerged. Before awakening, most people are taught a story about love so deeply that they never question it. It begins quietly, almost invisibly, as children watching the adults around them. We learn that love is something we must earn, something we must qualify for, something we must exchange. Over time, without realizing it, we begin to treat love the way merchants treat goods. We evaluate, we compare, we bargain, we present only the polished parts of ourselves, hoping someone will choose us from the shelf before we gather too much dust. This is why so many relationships feel like two hungry ghosts meeting in the dark. Not because people are unkind or insincere, but because both come to the table believing they are incomplete. Each one carries a private fear that they are not enough on their own, and each hopes the other will silence that fear. So the connection becomes a subtle transaction. I will soothe your emptiness if you soothe mine. I will be as you want me to be, if you promise to fill the hollow place I am afraid to face. We dress this exchange in romance. We call it destiny or chemistry or passion. But beneath the sweetness lies a quiet panic. The panic of losing the one thing we believe keeps us whole. The panic of not being chosen. The panic of returning to the shelf as unwanted merchandise. So we perform. We fix our hair. We choose our words carefully. We curate our smiles like advertisements. We hope someone will look at us and say, "You are the missing piece I have been searching for." For a moment, this illusion works. The excitement, the rush, the intoxication of being desired creates the temporary illusion of completeness. But this kind of love is fragile because it depends on two people protecting a shared illusion, an illusion that neither of them is enough without the other. And when you awaken, even slightly, something inside you begins to question this entire structure. You start to sense that a relationship built on fear cannot lead to freedom. You begin to feel that love rooted in hunger can never truly nourish. There is a reason we use the phrase falling in love. The language reveals more truth than we realize. People do not rise into love, they fall into it, as if slipping into a hole they did not see coming. The experience feels sudden, overwhelming, electric. But beneath the excitement is something far less romantic. Need. Raw, unspoken, carefully hidden need. Most people fall in love because they cannot stand the quiet of being alone with themselves. They fall because the presence of another person feels like a life raft thrown into the waters they believe they are drowning in. So two people reach out for each other, not from fullness, but from fear. They cling to one another like life preservers, convinced that without the other, they will sink into their own emptiness. And the world praises this. We celebrate the fever of new attraction, the sleepless nights, the racing thoughts, the desperate longing. We treat these symptoms as proof of love, when in truth, they are signs of dependency. We glorify the fall without ever asking why we were falling in the first place. But look closely, and you'll see the pattern. The rush is fueled by panic. The passion is fueled by the need to escape ourselves. The desire to merge with someone else comes from the belief that we are not enough as we are. And the moment the other person pulls away or hesitates, the panic rises again. The fear returns. The drowning begins. This is why the falling never lasts. Because it was never love to begin with. It was need, wearing a beautiful costume. A temporary escape disguised as connection. A momentary relief mistaken for intimacy. And when a person begins to awaken, even faintly, they start to see through this pattern. They notice how much of what they once called love was simply fear in disguise. Fear of being alone. Fear of being unseen. Fear of facing the quiet spaces within themselves. Awakening does not make you stop wanting love. It simply makes you unable to confuse falling with loving. Awakening changes the way you see many things, but one of the first illusions it strips away is the illusion of romantic certainty. The moment your awareness sharpens, even slightly, you begin to notice details that were invisible before. You start seeing the subtle bargains hidden beneath affection, the quiet fears beneath passion, the longing beneath every promise. And suddenly, what once felt like magic begins to look like a performance whose tricks you finally understand. It is like watching a magician on stage once someone has shown you where he hides the rabbit. You can still appreciate the artistry, the timing, the elegance of the motion. You may even enjoy the show. But you are no longer fooled. You see the wires holding up the stage. You see how the illusion works, and you cannot unsee it. The love songs that once moved you start to sound like neediness dressed up in moonlight. The dramatic declarations that once made your heart flutter now reveal the anxiety behind them. This does not make you cynical. It makes you clear. It makes you honest in a way that feels both liberating and unsettling. You realize how much of your romantic life was built on the hope that someone else could complete you. You realize how often you molded yourself to fit the expectations of another, not out of love, but out of fear of losing the illusion that kept you from facing your own emptiness. When awakening deepens, you begin to notice how the stories of romance rely on mutual hypnosis. Two people agreeing to believe in a narrative that keeps their insecurities quiet. Two people pretending that the other is the answer to a question they have never had the courage to ask. And when you see through it, truly see through it, something inside you shifts. The old game no longer holds the same charm. The old patterns no longer seduce you. The trick has been revealed, and no matter how beautifully it is performed, you cannot pretend it is real. This clarity is not coldness. It is not detachment. It is simply the end of being fooled by your own longing. It is the beginning of recognizing that what you thought was love was often fear wearing a convincing mask. As awakening settles into your life, you begin to sense something quietly revolutionary. The emptiness you once tried so desperately to escape was never emptiness at all. It was space. Spaciousness, room to breathe, room to be. The terrifying void you imagined inside yourself turns out to be nothing more than the mind's fear of its own depth. And for the first time, you notice that you are not half of anything. You are not a broken piece looking for its missing partner. You are not a fragment wandering the world hoping someone will glue you back together. You begin to feel a wholeness that does not depend on anyone's approval or presence. A completeness that has always been there, buried beneath years of conditioning. It is like a wave suddenly realizing it does not need another wave to become water. It already is water. It has always been water. The search for something outside yourself begins to lose its urgency. You stop scanning every room for potential saviors. You stop reading meaning into every glance, every compliment, every small moment of attention. The constant hunger that once pulled you toward others becomes quieter, softer, less demanding. This shift is subtle but profound. You no longer reach outward to fix an inner problem. The problem dissolves, not because someone healed you, but because you finally saw that there was nothing to heal. What you thought was a wound was only a misunderstanding. What you called loneliness was actually the discomfort of meeting yourself without distraction. And when you stand in this wholeness, even for a moment, the old patterns of love lose their power. You cannot chase people the way you once did. You cannot cling, bargain, negotiate, or mold yourself into shapes that do not belong to you. You simply do not need to. This is the beginning of a new way of loving, a way born not from hunger, but from fullness, not from fear, but from freedom. Once you begin to experience your own wholeness, a different kind of loneliness arises. It is not the old loneliness, the one filled with longing and fear, the one that pushed you toward anyone who offered even a hint of affection. No. This loneliness feels quieter, more spacious, but also strangely isolating. It appears not because you are empty, but because you are no longer able to participate in the illusions that once connected you to others. You start to see the games people play in love, the unspoken contracts, the silent expectations, the careful performances crafted to gain validation or security. And you find yourself unable to join in, not because you think you're above it, but because something inside you refuses to pretend anymore. It feels like being the only adult at a children's party. The children run around fully absorbed in their games, taking every moment with absolute seriousness. Their imaginary worlds are vivid, their dramas intense, their victories grand. But you cannot make yourself believe in those games anymore. You can watch with affection, even with admiration, but you cannot step back into the story as if it were real. So you meet someone new. They're kind, attractive, interesting. And in the past, this would have been enough for the story to begin. The familiar arc of excitement, projection, longing, and pursuit. But now, you see the entire arc before the first scene even starts. You see where the expectations will appear. You see which fears will surface. You see how both of you would eventually try to use each other to soothe insecurities that have nothing to do with love at all. And because you see it, you cannot pretend you don't. You cannot unknow what you know. The curtain has been pulled back, and the stage no longer holds the same magic. This new loneliness is simply the distance between clarity and illusion. The quiet space you occupy when you can no longer lie to yourself for the comfort of belonging. As your clarity deepens, something subtle but unmistakable begins to shift inside you. The standard for what you call love rises on its own, not because you become demanding, not because you expect perfection, but because you can no longer be satisfied with what once passed for connection. The old way of loving relied on unspoken agreements, on shared illusions, on two people meeting each other's fears rather than meeting each other's truth. But awakening breaks that spell. You can no longer walk blindly into a story you already see the ending of. You cannot pretend not to notice the trap when it is right in front of you. You cannot drink the same poison you once begged for, now that you know what it contains. And this inability is not resistance, it is clarity. It is the simple result of seeing too clearly how the old patterns were fueled by hunger, not love. So the way you relate changes. You are no longer charmed by appearances or swept away by chemistry. You are no longer moved by someone's longing for you or tempted by the promises they make in moments of excitement. Instead, you look for something quieter, rarer, more real. You look for someone who has also seen through the game, someone who does not want you to complete them, someone who does not approach you as a solution to their fear of being alone. You look for someone who is whole, or at least someone who is awakening to their own wholeness. Because only from that place can two people truly meet. Not as lifelines, not as bandages, not as cures for each other's wounds, but as two expressions of the same ocean, two waves that recognize their shared source without trying to merge into one another out of fear. This standard makes connection harder because it eliminates most possibilities. The relationships that once felt meaningful now feel shallow. The excitement that once dazzled you now feels like noise. And the gestures that once convinced you now feel like shadows on a wall. But this is not a loss. It is simply the natural consequence of awakening. Once you have tasted truth, illusion cannot satisfy you. Once you have felt your own completeness, you cannot pretend to be incomplete for the sake of belonging. As your standard rises, something else becomes clear. Truly awakened companionship is rare. Not rare in the sense of superior or exclusive, but rare in the sense that most people are still playing the old game with great seriousness. They are still searching for their other half, still trying to patch the quiet wounds they have never looked at directly, still building relationships on hopes, fears, and unspoken bargains. You once lived this way too, until you didn't. Now, the field of possibility narrows, where once you could feel drawn to someone's smile, their confidence, their charm, or even just the comfort of their attention. Now those things are no longer enough. They do not reach the place where you actually live. You look at the picture book simplicity of old patterns and realize you can no longer return to them. It feels like you have learned to read, and the stories that once captivated you now lack substance. This is where the rarity becomes unmistakable. You begin to see how few people speak the language you now understand. Not a language of words, but of presence, of clarity, of an inner stillness that does not cling or grasp or demand. You wait for someone whose eyes reflect the same recognition, someone who does not need to be saved and does not need you to play a role in their personal myth. You look for those who breathe the same air, metaphorically speaking. Those who have walked into the same inner landscapes, seen the same illusions fall apart, and made peace with the emptiness that once frightened them. Such people exist, but they are not many. They move differently. They love differently. They relate without neediness and meet others without projection. And so you find yourself alone more often, not because you are unlovable, but because what you seek is rare. You are waiting not for perfection, but for a connection rooted in truth rather than fear, waiting for someone who meets you as an equal, not as a missing piece. There comes a point on the path where you realize awakening is a one-way door. Once you have stepped through it, there is no going back, no matter how comforting the old world once felt. You cannot unknow what you know. You cannot shrink yourself back into the smaller shape you once lived inside. And this, more than anything, is what makes love feel different after awakening. You may try to return to the old patterns. You may try to let yourself be swept away by the familiar dramas, the subtle performances, the emotional negotiations you once called romance. But the moment you attempt it, something inside you resists. It feels like putting on a costume that no longer fits. The fabric is too tight. The seams scratch. The character you once played so convincingly now feels foreign, almost absurd. Even if you tried to pretend, the pretense would collapse. Because you have seen behind the curtain, you know where the illusions come from. You know how much of what people call love is fueled by fear, by longing, by the desire to escape themselves. The counterfeit sweetness of these patterns no longer captivates you. The taste that once felt intoxicating now feels thin, artificial, without substance. And so you wait. Not out of desperation, but out of integrity. You refuse to kneel in illusion just to silence the ache of being alone. You refuse to enter relationships that require you to betray the truth you have found. You refuse to abandon clarity for the comfort of company. This waiting is not passive. It is active, alive, dignified. It is the stance of someone who understands that truth is worth the solitude it may demand. You continue living. You grow. You explore the world with open eyes and an unburdened heart. But you do not force connection where there is no resonance. You do not settle for companionship built on need. And yes, there are moments when the silence feels heavy. Nights when you wonder whether the path has cost you something precious. But even in those moments, you know the alternative is worse. To go back to sleep. To willingly blind yourself again. To trade clarity for comfort. In time, something quiet and profound begins to unfold. After the loneliness, after the longing, after the waiting with an open yet discerning heart, you discover that the love you thought you were missing has never been absent. You realize that what you were searching for in another person was really a reflection of something already living within you. This understanding does not arrive as a dramatic revelation. It appears gently, like dawn, soft, undeniable, quietly transformative. You begin to sense that love is not a possession or a partnership or a mutual contract. It is a way of being, a way of meeting the world without fear, a way of breathing without needing to grasp. It flows through you effortlessly when you are no longer trying to extract it from someone else. It moves like water. It shines like sunlight. It expresses itself as naturally as birds taking flight. And if someday you meet someone who lives from this same fullness, the connection will feel different from anything that came before. There will be no falling, no clinging, no desperate merging. There will be a recognition. Two beings who are already whole, choosing to share space, not to complete each other, but to celebrate the completeness they have each discovered. Two waves greeting each other as expressions of the same ocean, without trying to become one out of fear. But even if that person never appears, you are not incomplete. You are not lacking. You have come home to yourself. You have rediscovered the love that was never dependent on another face, another voice, another presence. The love that is not an exchange, but a state of consciousness. The love that has always been the ground of your being. This is why the awakened struggle to find love in the usual way. Not because love has abandoned them, but because they can no longer confuse illusion with truth. They choose to remain in clarity even if it means standing alone. They choose freedom over fantasy. And in doing so, they finally discover the love that cannot be lost.